Shema Yisrael, right? Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's the statement that sums up everything. It sums up the life of a Jew. It sums up everything we're supposed to try to achieve. It sums up what the world is all about, as it says in Zechariah, right? B'yamahu Hashem Echad Shema Echad. That Kosh Baruch will be king over the entire land, and everybody will understand and acknowledge that he is one. And this has been the ongoing struggle all through history. When Moshe Rabbeinu shows up in Mitzrayim and he goes to Paro and he says to Paro, let my people go, and Paro says nothing doing. As we've mentioned many times in the past, it's not because Paro did not believe in God. Contrary to popular thought, he definitely believed in God and God of the Jewish people, other gods too, but he believed in the God of the Jewish people. He believed in Elohim, as Rashi points out. He believed that God brought the flood, and every 1,656 years he does that. But he works b'derech teva. He works it naturally through nature, and therefore the laws of nature, they override. And since Moshe Rabbeinu, the Jewish people, they didn't have an army, they didn't have the merits for miracles, so therefore he wasn't afraid. And then Moshe said, yeah, but I'm not coming in the name of Elohim, I'm coming in the name of Hashem. And Paro says, Mi Hashem, right? Who is this Hashem business, and why should I listen to him? And I'm not letting you go. So Moshe says, funny you should ask that question. Let's get back to you in another year or so and see if you understand on your own exactly who Hashem is. So Paro gambled, and in the end, the Esher Makos, the 10 Makos come along, and they teach Paro and the Egyptian people that Hashem is Elohim, except that there are times in history where Kosh Baruch Hu literally flexes his muscles, so to speak, shows the world who he is and reveals himself. And then he gave us thousands of years to make that point to the entire world. That's part of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We say that twice a day. I don't know how many people think about it, but what you're supposed to be reminding yourself, this is what I'm supposed to do. When you wake up in the morning, you're supposed to ask the question, how am I able to unify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How am I today, whatever I do, whatever I'm going to go accomplish, whatever is happening in the world, the war in Russia, Ukraine, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in America, what's happening here, it's all dovetailing eventually towards one finale, one conclusion. B'yamahu Hashem Echad Shema Echad, that God will be one, and we know that that's the main point, because we also know that the Amalek, who is the main antagonist of the Jewish people, the nemesis of the Jewish people throughout history, even if he's not here actually physically, but the reality of Amalek is a spiritual concept too, that he comes to do this, just the opposite. He's the antithesis of the Shema. As Rashi points out, as we mentioned last week, Yad al Kes Ka, right? The Aleph is missing from the Kisei, and the Vav K is missing from the Yud K. Because that's what Amalek does. Whether he does it physically, whether he does it spiritually, whether he does it himself, whether it's an atmospheric thing, but somehow there's this reality where we have Vayikar versus Vayikra, and the Aleph is from the Kisei, which is also from the word Adam, and a couple other here and there as well, and it's all part of the same idea, and it's all what we're struggling with. I mean, amazingly, it's the most important thing that we need to know and live by, and yet it's probably something that we barely think about during the course of our day, even though we might say the Shema 3 times a day, once before going to bed at night as well. And yet it's the whole tafkid. It's all that we're about. There's not, everything else is basically just a means to get there. It's all a sideshow. And Amalek does the best he can to keep us from fulfilling that purpose, whatever course he takes. And just to show you, how practical this actually is that today, for example, science or scientists will tell you that you don't need God for creation, that God doesn't exist, and that the world can function just fine without him, and the mysteries of life can be solved for the most part, and the ones that are not solvable yet, we will eventually solve, but you don't need God in the equation. That's Amalekian in nature. Science itself is wonderful. The Vilna Gaon in Kol HaTorah mentions the Shiva Chachmaot, the 7 types of wisdom, music, mathematics, it's like things that we're supposed to use to megala, to reveal the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The actual, knowledge is knowledge. There's the Yetzer Das Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and there's the Yetzer Chaim, the tree of life. but it all comes from the tree of life: science, mathematics, medicine, architecture, whatever it is. If it somehow enhances your appreciation of Ma'aseh Bereishis and encourages you to accomplish more in life that's meaningful and be a part of it, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, in the perfection of Ma'aseh Bereishis, it's good, it's kosher. Every knowledge can be abused, including Torah knowledge. One of the most remarkable insights that I gained years ago was finding out, after never hearing this or even thinking about it, you think of the Eitz of Hara, the tree of knowledge, good deal. It's an evil thing, right? Even though it's got good in it, but it's the chet, the sin came through that. We're in exile for thousands of years because of the Eitz of Hara. So think of the tree, it's always evil. Eitz Chaim, good. Eitz of Hara, evil. Until you find out that even Gemara, Talmud, falls under the category of Eitz Hara, because anything that deals with good and evil, by definition, falls into that category. And you know what else? So do we. Everybody since the chet of the Eitz Hara, ever since we absorbed and inherited our Yetzer Hara, an internal Yetzer Hara became a part of us, we also have the status of the Eitz Hara. The only thing really today that seems to have, even though we refer to Torah in general as Eitz Chaim Hi L'Machazikim Ba, right? But the only aspect of Torah that really seems to have an official title of Eitz Chaim, and Eitz Chaim means there's no Ra mixed into it, is Kabbalah, is Sod itself. It's referred to as Eitz Chaim, which is why the Rizal called his main sefer Eitz Chaim. Not just because he liked the name, but because that's what it is. And there's all, we spoke about how learning the Zohar is crucial to being able to avoid the war of Gog and Magog and Chevli Mashiach and things like that. But the bottom line is that our job is to miyached Elokim with Havaya, as the Shema tells us, simple statement, but tied to the Or HaGanuz. It's a Chanukah shir. It goes all over the place. It's so massive. It's so overwhelmingly awesome to go through all the details, because for hours. But we have Purim coming up. It's already Tanis Esther, Baruch Hashem, Yiganu, to this point, and already tomorrow's Purim, God willing. And it's like so many different things have already pointed out how Purim is the last holiday to become batal, the last holiday to be canceled out, because it corresponds to the sphere of Chachma, which is the second highest sphere in the entire system, which is just one of those things that just blows your mind, because you're matching it. It's like a shidduch between the wealthiest person in the world and the poorest person in the world, seemingly, or the smartest person in the world and the least intelligent. It's like there's, okay, it's possible you can do it, but it just doesn't seem to fit. This doesn't work. So, Chachma is Chachma. It's like not just wisdom, it's the ultimate wisdom. It's way up there in Olam Haba, way up there. We don't even know what that Chachma means. We just have a little taste of it down here. Literally, just a little, whatever you think. As the smartest person, the biggest makubal in the world, still doesn't know the true reality of Torah yet. That's being reserved until Yemos Mashiach. And that's Chachma. And the holidays correspond to different spheres, because everything corresponds to the spheres. You, me, the entire world, it's all built in the spheres. And of all of the holidays that you had to match, the last one, right? Chachma, you think, what's the holiest holiday? Yom Kippur? No, that's not the one. Rosh Hashanah? No, for sure not. Pesach? No, much, Which holiday are we going to match up with Chachma? Purim? And just to emphasize the point, it's like Chazal. Every holiday that we eat as part of the holiday, we have a Suda. People say, where are you going for the Suda? It's not a Suda. It's a Mishta. A Mishta is a drinking feast. A Mishta is what you imagine people who don't have religion do. They go hang at the bar. Purim is a Mishta. And that's holy. We see what Purim brings out in people. Pesach, people don't go around ripping doors off buses. I watched a guy who was drunk try and do that. They don't go doing, they don't drive, crazily. like all the chagim, they bring out kedusha. Either people celebrate or they don't celebrate, but they bring, Purim. It's like people silly costumes, and that yet corresponds to the highest level of all. So there's this big separation, this big gap that has to be resolved, has to be brought together, and we have to have understanding of what that means. And to do that, we actually have something that's right in our midst right now, and I know I've referred to before in the past, but I find it to be the best way to put it all together in so short a period of time, because it's something that we're all familiar with, that I've been reading about the last several weeks already. So I present to you, and I'll share my screen here. Okay, Exhibit 3. For those who don't recognize this is clearly the Mishkan, right? These are the dimensions over here. This is the outer curtain around the entire Mishkan, 100 by 50, right? And inside, this is the actual courtyard. This is the area inside. This is the Mishkan itself. Are these two boxes right here? The smaller box is 10 amas by 10 amas, and amas about between 1.5 feet to 2 feet. So it's about 18. It's about 18 to 24 feet by 24 feet. Depends on how you hold, right? This is the Kodesh, or the sanctuary. Inside here, over here was the menorah. This is where the shulchan, right, the lech mapanim was. The mizbecha ketoris, the incense altar was right here. I meant to put it on, but I forgot to do that. Right inside here is where the Arna Kodesh was. This is the Mishkan itself. This little area is the Mishkan. This gray thing here you say is the Mizbeach, the Aru Mizbeach, where they did the sacrifices of animals. And inside here is the Chatzir itself. And you'll see some very interesting dimensions, right? And a couple other pieces of information, which we're now going to explain, B'ezras Hashem. There are 4 mitzvahs on Purim, right? You have Mikra Megillah is the first mitzvah. We do that at night, and we do that in the morning. Then you have the second mitzvah of Matanos of Yonim, right? Tzedakah, very special time to give tzedakah, seemingly more than the rest of the year. The Rambam is a halacha. You don't turn anyone down. Doesn't make a difference what they look like. So kids, of course, come around looking for tzedakah that day, right? But something to everybody, as much as you possibly can. And then you have the mitzvah of Mishlach Manas. It's a very unusual mitzvah. And then you have the mitzvah of Mishta, which is the Suda, right? The Mishta itself. Those are the 4 mitzvahs. We had to organize them in order of importance. Try to put some color in here to make it a little bit more festive, right? If you try to organize it in order of importance, so what would you think would be first? In my mind, when I first approached this, I would have thought the Megillah is the most important of all. Why? Torah. It's not part of Torah itself. It's part of Ksuvim, but nonetheless, it's part of Tanakh. Everything else is a nice thing. It's an important thing. It's not saying it's not important, but it's to give tzedakah. But the Megillah itself is Ruach HaKodesh, history. So many reasons why I would make that the most important mitzvah of all. Second most important mitzvah would be Matanos of Yonim, giving tzedakah to the poor, because that's a huge mitzvah. That's such a tikkun for the world. And after that, the third mitzvah I would say would be Mishlach Manas. That's, it's not as important as Matanos of Yonim, because the people who receive tzedakah, they need the money. Mishlach Manas is for people, who don't necessarily need it, and usually don't. And often, just put it aside and maybe even reprocess it and recycle it and give it to somebody else. But it's a mitzvah, so that's the third most important. Of course, the least important mitzvah, I would have thought, because it's the most self-serving, is the Mishta. That's what makes sense to me, right? Lo and behold, I have it upside down. I have it backwards. But then again, that's Purim, Nafachu. Everything is like upside down. It's all, turned around backwards. And you realized, and you have to realize, that if you felt the same way I did, it's because we're upside down in the end. We're the ones walking on the ceiling, so to speak. But that's where we were born and raised and live in a world like that. Meanwhile, often it's an upside down world. Yeah. The amazing thing is how the ground is the ground, but intellectually, psychologically, it's an upside down world. We see things backwards and upside down. And that's the reason why I did it that way, because I came from the perspective of a world that I'm used to, where you go from the physical to the spiritual. And yet it turns out just the opposite, that the least, so to speak, important mitzvah, we'll see why in a second, not really in terms of importance, but in terms of chashivas, is the Megillah. And we'll see why. And then comes Matos Yonim, even though it's tzedakah, right? And then comes Mishloach, and the most important mitzvah of the day, the holiest mitzvah, which makes sense because, after all, Purim is a progression. The entire period of time is a progression. We have a thing called Shovavim, which begins with Parashat Shmos, because that's the redemption of the Jewish people from Mitzrayim. And that began a period of building of divine life for the sake of redemption that will end, so to speak, with Pesach, not really end. It will continue on, but that's like one of the climaxes before a new chapter begins. And we have an extra Adar this year to increase the light that we'll have in advance of Purim and Pesach. So it's been a progression the entire time. Likewise, the day of Purim is a progression. So you start with one mitzvah and you build towards another and towards another, towards another, to finally get to the Mishkan. And you'll notice I have them over here corresponding to different areas of the Mishkan itself. The dimensions play a very important role. So in the Mishkan, basically, you had a curtain in front here. The entranceway was 20 amas wide. And then you had a little curtain over this that blocked the view inside the Mishkan, into the courtyard of the Chatzar itself. And you came inside the Chatzar itself was 50 amas by 50 amas. And then that brought you to the entranceway to the Heichel, which only the Kohanim from this point could go into. That was 20 amas deep, as it says over here. And of course, you have the Kodesh Kodeshim, which is 10 by 10. Now, this progression is very important. Why? Because this is the map of life. This is literally the map of life from childhood until the day you die. What's going on here right now. Purim is just emphasizing this. Purim is just re-educating us. It's the source of Bechir. It's the source of freedom in the head. As we'll see by Pesach time, the whole point of the Makos in Mitzrayim was specifically to enlarge the olive of Adam, right? A person is an Adam. Human beings are called Adam. Adam is an olive, which represents the soul. And the Daled Mem represents the blood, which is the physical component of the person. And the Jewish people, Amem Teshari Tuma in Mitzrayim, the 49th level of spiritual impurity, they were holding on the level only of the physical, part of their existence, which is the dam, the blood. And you want to go free, you have to build the aleph. So the aleph is built by becoming increasingly more aware of Hashem and his reality, from going from Vayikar to Vayikra, right? The aleph, and from Elokim to Havaya, Yudke Vavke, Hashem. That's, and then of course, once you get there, Memela, automatically you're free. And the gematria of Adam is Gula, because when a person becomes what's called an Adam Shalem, a complete person, Memela, you go free. And that's what's all built into here. It's all tied into this, the whole concept of the Mishkan. So let's just start right now. How does this work? So the world outside the Mishkan, which corresponds to Megillah, like the Megillah itself, it doesn't mention Hashem. There's no mention of Hashem in the entire Megillah. We know it's Hashem. We know the miracle. We see the Hashgacha Prati. That's for sure. That's the whole point. But Hashem is not mentioned anywhere. Although they say when it says HaMelech, that's a remnant. It's a hint to Hashem, but doesn't mention Hashem per se. Now they could have easily, but they didn't, because that's the way the miracle worked. It wasn't so obvious. It's not like Chumash where God spoke to the Jewish people, or in Tanakh where God spoke to a Navi. This is talking about past that period of time. There's still prophecy, but nonetheless, it's Hashgacha Pratis that's running the show over here, vis-a-vis the world of nature. So there's no mention of Hashem anywhere in the Megillah, but that corresponds to the outside world that we live in every day. That's the world beyond the Mishkan. That's the world that the average person has to cope with and go to work and take care of the family. And so distracting, it's so easy to forget there's a God. If not intellectually, then certainly emotionally. I mean, all day long, we forget about God. There are some people who set their watches every hour to beep, an alarm that goes off. They pull out of their pocket the six constant mitzvahs that remind you that God is there. because Amalek, one way or another, is distracting us away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from Hashem, His divine providence, that and separating the heart from the mind. That's what's going on. It's like that. That's what everything is trying to do. Like sever, like an operation to sever the mind from the heart, so that whatever we know doesn't go down to here. Because as long as the heart is not feeling the reality of Hashem, everything is possible. Every type of sin, chet, is possible. So that's the outside world. Now, this 20 over here, we know the significance of this 20 because the Gemara says that you cannot place a menorah or an erev or the roof of the sukkah higher than 20 amas. Why not? So the Gemara says, Ein a sholtabeh. The eye can't see that far, but we all know you can make a bigger menorah. You can make a menorah that's so huge, you can put it 100 amas in the sky, in the air, and you can still see it. Or you make a huge sukkah where the cell of the, it's higher than 20, but if the sukkah is big enough, the proportion of the sukkah to the walls, such that if the sun you'll be sitting in a sukkah. So why still you can't put 20 amas high? And of course, an erev is a little bit different because you have to see the erev, but there's ways of making the erev more pronounced. You can flashing lights on the wire to remind us here's the erev, a big sign that says this is where the erev ends or begins. So the size could change the whole reality, but still 20 is important. Why? Because 20 is a number that represents more than simply physical blindness or physical limitation. It represents a spiritual blindness, something that exists outside here. So that corresponds also to the final Hey of Hashem's name. You usually write Hashem's name horizontally, Yud, K, Vav, K, right? But in this case, it's vertical, Yud, K, Vav, K, because it turns out that the 4 letters of Hashem's name also correspond to the 10 spheres. For example, the Yud, which has a little, in a Sefer Torah, has a little crown in it, right? The little coat, so on top of it, tug. And the tug itself, the crown corresponds to the level of Keser. This is like a crown. So it's like a crown in the letter itself. The Yud itself corresponds to Chachma. The Hey corresponds to the second highest sphere, the third highest sphere called Bina. And then you have the Vav, which is 6, corresponds to the 6 spheres of Chesed through Yesod. And finally, the final Hey corresponds to the Malchus. Anytime a person does a Chet, they act as if God's not in the world. They push the Hey away from the upper 3 levels, and they loosen the connection between the Vav and the levels above it. So the final Hey corresponds to the outside area, which we call the world of Malchus, the world that we live in, our world that we belong to. In that world, in the meantime, until Hashem becomes king, Melech, over the Malchus in Yemos and Mashiach, in the meantime, you can have Hester Panim. You can have it that people don't recognize the reality of God, even deny. Agnosticism and atheism are the most ridiculous things in the world. Ridiculous. The only reason why they exist, the only reason why, is because God is so patient, he doesn't respond. It's like a person who gets insulted. There are people who respond and they feel bad about it, and people, they just brush it off. It doesn't affect them. So God has this phenomenal patience where people insult him. They use the world that he created to deny his reality. They eat the food they created, and he created, and they don't thank him for it. And any other rule will zap the person. Lightning will come down from the sky. A person says, I'm an atheist, and lightning comes down from the sky. Reminds me of a joke. If I have time, maybe I'll tell you wrong. But the point is, this is the outside world. This corresponds to the Hey of Hashem's name, the world, the Megillah, and the world that we're used to living in. Here's the veil, because you can't see inside. You can't, literally a person who lives in this level of Megillah, the Hey, they can't see inside. You have to go inside first to be able to do it. How do you do that? So this corresponds to 50 by 50. You might recall that Haman, once he decided to kill Mordechai, he built a gallows. He built an 8, and a reference to the tree of knowledge, good and evil, but that's a share to itself. He built an 8. How high did he build the 8? It says 50 amas high. That's about 100 feet. It is way more than enough to hang Mordechai. It would have been a simple gallows normally. It's like a tree height. basically. Not that the person can drop down, their feet don't hit the ground, so they can hang and be choked to death or break their neck, whatever the case may be. But 50 amas in the air, you won't even know who's hanging from it. It's so high up in the air. Why did they build it so high? So the priest says because Haman, being from Amalek, sensed that there's going to be an influx of Nun Shari Bina, of Torah into the world, and he wanted to preempt it by counteracting it, by counteracting the 50 gates of understanding that are the basis of Torah, of all wisdom, by creating a gallows that would hang Mordechai, whom he understood was going to be the point man, because we know that Purim is Kabbalah Torah part 2. Mount Sinai, Har Sinai, 50 days after leaving Mitzrayim, the Jewish people received Torah. But as it says in the Gemara, they received the Torah Shabbat, the written law, with love. But the oral law, it's complicated, detailed, not so easy. That had to be accepted with a full heart. That didn't happen to Purim times. The Purim, we are told, is in fact Kabbalah Torah part 2, the receiving of Torah part 2. So anytime there's going to be Torah being learned, that you have to teach it, you're going to receive it. The Nun Shari Bina, that's the vehicle that God uses to impart that wisdom to man. So if a person drinks from the water of Torah, they're in fact drinking the Nun Shari Bina, whatever level you're learning at. It could be the most basic pasuk of a Chumash, a Rashi. It's part of the Nun Shari Bina. You go higher up to a higher level, right? To Mishnah or Gemara, and eventually Sod. It's all Nun Shari Bina. But like gates are different levels of gates. You go higher and higher. So the Chatzar, where the Mizbech was, and some of the miracles began to happen, this corresponds to the Nun Shari Bina. If a person is able to learn Torah and take in the Nun Shari Bina, it will change her perspective. And this is the mechanics. This is like the electrical plant, so to speak, of becoming a Baal Tshuva. Yeah, a person, it comes from the kotel, they travel to Israel, they go to the kotel, they get picked up at the kotel, they come to yeshiva, where they talk to them, they try to convince them to come to a class, they come to a class, and they start to learn. He might argue in the beginning, that eventually he starts to like it, thinks it makes a lot of sense, and goes one class after another class after another class, and eventually what happens basically is they start to realize this is probably true. And they start to rethink their whole life and all their priorities. And they start to change the way they look and the way they dress and what they do and what's important to them. So what's going on? Well, this is what's going on. They're walking through the Mishkan of life. Because don't forget, it says in Parshas Truma that before the chet of the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, each and every one of us, were supposed to be a Mishkan. God was supposed to dwell inside each and every one of us as if we were Mishkan. So this is us. Because of the golden calf, we showed that we couldn't live up to that level at this point in time. So therefore God said, okay, I'm going to take all that and put into a Mishkan, an actual physical Mishkan. But this is who we're supposed to be. This corresponds to the body. This corresponds to the heart, the mind, and what we're supposed to become. So, a person gets to, across the Chatzar, and they learn Torah, they get to the Kodesh, where the menorah and the shochan and the Ketaris, which correspond to Das, which is a high level of knowledge we spoke about in last week's shir, and that's over here. Now, only a Kohen can go into the actual Kodesh, but we're called B'mlechas Kohanim, because when a person learns Nun Shari Bina, what happens instead is they start to actually rise in levels of Kedusha. So in a sense, we physically can't go into the Kodesh, but we do psychologically and spiritually by becoming more holy, which we do by learning more Torah. If a person learns Torah and does not become holier because of it, they're not really learning Torah. Well, why? Why does it follow? Because by definition, if a person learns Torah and they understand what they're learning, and they take it to heart, memela, automatically they become more like God. You become more godlike, more godly, more like your soul, really. Because what Torah basically does is it neutralizes the body to allow the soul to take control. The soul is like God. That's why it corresponds to the Aleph, because the Aleph corresponds to God. One, Aluf, a chief. So basically, that's the whole process. You get to the Kodesh, and the Kodesh is 20 amas deep. But wait a second. Didn't we just mention over here that 20 represents spiritual blindness? Yes and no. It only does before the Nun Shari Bina, before a person learns Torah. But if you learn the same thing after, not only does it not blind you to the reality of God, but it actually enhances it, improves it. Lamashal, an example of this would be basically, and I used to say, when I was at Torah, we used to see this happen very often, that a person would come in and over the course of days and maybe a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, maybe even a whole summer, they'd come to realize that Torah is true. They'd come to accept that this is the way to live. And they start taking a mitzvahs and all that, but they have this obligation to go back to college. Their parents are waiting for them. The college is waiting for them. They're not yet at the point where they can make that sacrifice and push it off. And they promise that they're going to go to college for 2-3 years, whatever, get the degree, and then come back and go to yeshiva and finish their Jewish education, the Torah education. And more often than not, they don't do that. More often than not, what happens instead is they start to lose what they gained while in yeshiva. They start to forget about being in an environment that does not talk about God, does not promote God, even bashes the idea of God for the most part. Eventually, it just starts to wear away, and you start to forget how you felt about that knowledge. And as a result of that, the medicine, the architecture, the science, the physics, it starts to become a proof against God in the person's mind. It's not, but that's the way they start to look at it, and they start losing it. That's what happens if you do the 20 before the 50. Then you have those people who come into yeshiva and they realize, you know something? I can't leave until I'm solid in my Yiddishkeit. I can't leave until I have a good, strong foundation of what I learned. It's crucial. I know if I go out there without, where I'm holding right now, I'm going to lose it all. God forbid. So what do they do instead? They stay, they defer. They push it off for a year, 2 years. They talk to their parents, whatever, and they decide they're going to stay. And they stay for the 2-3 years. And then they go back to college. They do go back to college in the end. Not always. Sometimes they don't. But they do. And they go back to college. And now the exact same knowledge that caused the first guy to lose his connection becomes a reason to even strengthen the connection. Because why? They're building that knowledge on a foundation of Nun Shari Bina, a 50 by 50. As the Gra says, right? The 7 levels, layers of wisdom, of ideas of wisdom, other disciplines of knowledge. They're there to enhance. They're there to make us stronger in our book. They're there to act as a vehicle to prove, because don't forget, everything, all the knowledge in the world, no matter what it is, good or bad, it all comes from Torah. Because everything's in the Torah, it all comes from God. So somehow mathematics and engineering, they have to somehow reflect God, but you have to know how to make that reflection and make it real to you and make it real to other people. So that takes the Nun Shari Bina. So if you have the 20 after the 50, so then you get to 70, which of course is the Kodesh Kodeshim. The Kodesh Kodeshim was an interesting place. The Gemara says that the Arna Kodesh, this is where it was housed, right over here inside. The 2 poles went from side to side, and the Arna Kodesh is inside. And a very interesting happens, the Gemara says, in Megillah of all places, that the Arna Kodesh took up more space than was physically given to it inside the Kodesh. It was 10 by 10, but the Keruvim on top ended up being 20 by 20, and somehow it fits, right? Kind of like my my bank book sometimes, it's like, it doesn't make sense, but somehow it works out and it fits, right? There's Israel, not so much in Chutz La'aretz. Lots of people talk about that type of miracle over here. But it was L'malam Tefel, above, after 70. Now you'll notice, right? You'll notice that the whole Purim story revolves around the number 70. Because more than any other Galus, the Nevi'im, Yeshaya, Yirmiyahu, Daniel, they all predicted that the Jewish people would be in Galus Bavel for 70 years, and then God would remember us and redeem us and bring us back. The celebration of Purim is really the celebration of the fulfillment of that promise. And all these kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, all these different kings, and even Achashverosh, they believed in it. They actually believed in the prophecy, and they believed in the calculation, and they made their own to determine when the 70 years were up so they could see if God, in fact, came for them or didn't. If he didn't, we're off the hook. If he does come for them, we might have some problems. And they did. They died along the way because of it, wearing the clothing of Kohen Gadol. Eventually, Achashverosh himself also makes the mistake about this calculation, but it all revolves around the number 70. Why 70? Well, the Gemara says a very interesting thing. The Gemara says a person who drinks and is Matthias himself, he becomes settled, is the language, I think, of Matthias here. He becomes settled through his wine. That's what the Gemara starts off like that. Okay, so he's calm and relaxed. Has the das of his kona, is a das of God somehow. Das, this ultimately level of knowledge associated with Purim. This das, dalet ayin, tavish usually means knowledge, but here means specific knowledge of the reality of God. And he has a das of the Shivim, the 70s of Canaan, mentioned in Parashat Belosecha. Well, where's there anything? Why? Why? So the Gemara says a very interesting thing after that, right? The Gemara says because that the gematria of wine, because the number of wine and is equal to sod, right? That wine is yud yud nun, which is a gematria of 70, and sod, which means mystery or secret or Kabbalah, right, is equal to 70. Mishaniknas yayin yotze sod. That's the whole Gemara. The Gemara says when wine goes in, secrets come out. Now, again, we addressed this last week, and people understand it to mean that basically that the whole concept of drinking has to do with the idea of das, understanding that basically that if a person at least achieves this level of das, they're able to connect to Kosh Baruch on a whole different level, a much higher level of reality, above and beyond the physical world, above and beyond. Mordechai is able to come and go as he pleases, just like Moshe was able to come and go as he pleased in Paro's time. How did they do it? How was it that Paro put wild animals in his courtyard so that Moshe would be consumed by them when he came to talk to Paro? And the animals just laid down as if they weren't hungry. No, Moshe wasn't bothered by them. And they didn't bother Moshe. And likewise, right, when Mordechai, it's hard to imagine how Mordechai was able to go and taunt Haman and to be right in his face the entire time. And yet, Haman did not do anything. He wanted to. He made it a gezer against the Jewish people, and yet Mordechai is free to come and go as he pleases. Esther has to hide her identity because she's afraid what will happen to discover who she is, but not Mordechai. Why? Because Mordechai is living with the reality of the Yud. This is the level of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's the whole concept. The Mordechai was somebody who went from this level to this level to this level to this level, and once you reach the level of the Yud, it's not just a conceptual reality, it is possible in life. And honestly, there are times in life when if a person has a spiritual epiphany, they get to a high level and things happen in a way that just seem too hard to believe. I mean, absolutely miraculous. That it's like incredible. How is it possible? Well, the odds, the chances, yeah, it's a miracle. I mean, people who didn't believe before, who have a difficult time saying, that it's not a miracle, because the reality of God becomes so pronounced, yet it's still short. The final redemption, it's kind of a machlokas, a disagreement. The Gemara says that when it comes time for the final redemption, that the mentioning of the redemption from Egypt will become secondary to the redemption in the final days, the final redemption. So the assumption is that, well, it's because whatever happened in Egypt, it was spectacular, but whatever happened in Egypt will pale next to what's going to happen in the final redemption. The miracles that Hashem will do to save the Jewish people, the Medrash says, will be so fantastic that even people who did not participate in the war of Gog and Magog will be so impressed, and it will become so clear that God was behind it, that they too will become subservient to God in the process. Why? Because huge, massive miracles. So the Kli Yakar says, no, not that the miracles will be bigger. The difference was when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, they had to leave Bechipazon. And that's a discussion to itself, but they had to leave quickly. They could not leave in their own terms. We left Bavel, also kind of, when we were there, we were more relaxed about it, and some people had to stay behind. but we never really left on our own terms completely. When it comes to the final redemption, the Jewish people will be able to simply pick up and walk it on their own, as if no holds bars. But the question is, what does that mean? Right? Because so the miracles will be miracles. They'll be as great and probably anyhow greater than the miracles that took place back in Mitzrayim. But what does it actually mean? What's the holdback? The nations of the world? We'll take a look around today. I mean, it's true right now, it might be difficult for Jews to leave the Ukraine because of the war going on. But for the most part, as the Malbim predicted, the shibud of the Jewish people has come to an end. There's no real place. Well, what's the biggest hold up of Jews in the diaspora right now? Is themselves, ourselves. We're the ones. If the Jews wanted to leave America at the time, now, and certainly up until now, they could have come in, over the course of years. People didn't go because they didn't want to go. They didn't leave Canada. They didn't want to leave. They didn't leave England or Europe. They went back to Europe in the end. It's not the nations of the world that hold us back. The nations of the world only hold us back because we ourselves hold ourselves back. Where did we see this? So we see this in the attack of Amalek. Rashi asked the question, right? Why is the attack of Amalek, B'yavo Amalek, why is it right there in Parashat Bashalach? What's it doing connected to the water? As Rashi explains, when the Jewish people asked the question, Hayesh Hashem b'kibbenet im ayin, is God amongst us or not? Dapper Amalek. As if to say, if the Jewish people had not asked that question, the Jewish people had only asked the question, where's the water? Where do we get the water from? We asked for the food, and Baruch Hashem, you brought the man from Shemayim. Okay, you have to understand what it is exactly, but at least we have it now. And later on, you give us a slav, the meat. We ask for things, we seem to get it. And if we ask nicely, we get it nicely too, as Rashi points out. So now we're short of water. We all know we need water, right? How? From where? Okay. So, watch this. This is a great miracle. I'm going to hit the rock and the water comes out. But they asked more. They didn't ask that question. Hayesh Hashem b'kibbenet im ayin. Is God amongst us or not? Two different questions. Where is the water is a technical question I need to drink. Is God amongst us or not is a hashkafic question. It's a philosophical. Now, they had a reason for it. As the Leshem explains, they were worried. They were concerned. They're going into the midbar. They're going to the desert. It's a dangerous place. The only way to survive as a nation there is with miracles. And they want to know if those miracles will depend upon them and how they live their lives. If we do a chet and we sin, we can't get our act together, is God going to drop us off in the desert and leave us to our own devices? In which case, Moses will die of heat or starvation. So we need to know before we go into this desert what level of divine providence. That's the question they're asking. Nothing to do with water at all. Nothing at all. But Yavo Amalek, they had this doubt, right? They doubted divine providence, and Amalek, whose name means doubt, comes and attacks. And Rashi brings a mashal. Doesn't always do this. He feels compelled to do it here. And what does he say? It's like a father who's carrying his son on his shoulders the entire time, right? And for the beginning, the son understands and remembers that he's on his father's shoulders, and he says to his father, "Would you mind picking this up for me?" And the father picks it up. Would you mind picking it up? And keeps doing these things. For after a while, the son forgets he's on the shoulders of his father, and he sends to a passerby, "Have you seen my father?" So the father says, "What? I've been carrying you this entire time. You forgot I'm carrying you?" He takes him off his shoulders. He puts him down onto the ground, and a dog comes along and bites. And of course, Amalek is that dog. But it all began because the son asked the question, even if the dog had come, let's say, okay, on its own, taking the mashal to an extreme. Where's the son? On top of the father. He's safe. Nothing to worry about. Inside the clouds of glory. It's only because the son asked the question, "Have you seen my father? Is God amongst us or not?" That was everything. That was the whole turning point. That was like, from this point onward, even the Kabbalah of Torah cannot be complete. We run away from Har Sinai, we're punished for that. We're criticized for that. It's all downhill. I mean, the truth is, the Erev Rav, They were the problem. Moshe brought them out. Without them, none of that would have happened. None of that doubt. And the Gematria of Erev Rav is Das. Because all Das, we see, has two sides, two components. Eitz Das, Tov, V'Ra. The Torah is Das Tov. The Erev Rav is Das Ra. Yaakov is Das Tov. Esav is Das Ra. It's the same knowledge, of course. It's all a question of how you look at it, how you apply it. Is God amongst this knowledge or not? Is God amongst this body that's functioning miraculously, or is he not? Is God amongst the stars in the sky and the universe that's functioning the way it is, or not? Was God in the Holocaust, or not? That's the question that we keep asking ourselves. Is God with me or not? We don't always verbalize the question. We seem to ask it by the way we behave. So, for example, a person puts on tefillin thoughtlessly or not even all. It's like, God's not with me. If God was with me, would I do it this way? A person davens shachris or mincha mariv, and they make it a very automatic mechanical act. They don't really put their heart into it. That's like saying God's not with me. Because if God was with me, I wouldn't just treat him like this and talk to him like he was a stranger, like he was a nobody. My whole life depends, my heart beating right now depends upon him saying, heart, beat, 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 beat. I wouldn't take that for granted, like a guy with a gun to my head. I don't start talking to him rudely because I know he's got his finger on the trigger and he would pull it. So every time that we act in a way, in any way, it's there's levels, madrigas, that's life from moment to moment. Anytime we act in a way that in any way exhibits a lack of belief intellectually and then emotionally, it's like asking the question, is God amongst us or not? V'yavo Amalek, and the doubt comes in, and the doubt begins to fester, and doubt begins to grow, and we go to war against it, and too often we lose the battle, and pushes off the redemption, pushes off our own personal redemption. You have to think in terms of the Mishkan. You have to remember the process. We're going through every single day. We walk through the Mishkan, through the things we do, how we learn, what we understand. It's always up to us. If you're waiting for God to do this fantastic, miraculous thing, well, maybe he will, but very often he doesn't. And anyhow, besides, you can't rely upon that. But Purim says it's up to us. We are a Mishkan. We have an outside world, the one we live in, filled with distraction, makes us wonder where God is. But we also have a Chaser inside. We have Torah, the Nun Shari Bina. We can learn and we can absorb and we can change our perspective and become holy, holier, and become a Kodesh, where there is a menorah and there's a shochan and a mizbech, kataris, with the incense to connect to Kodesh Baruch Hu. And if we're really good, we go the full distance, the 70 represented by the yayin and the sod and the time until gula and so many other things as well. Because don't forget, Amalek is ayin malak, the severed ayin. He cuts off the eye. That's what Amalek comes to do. He comes to cut off that eye, to leave just whatever's after that. The mind's eye, your emotional connection to all this knowledge. We, every year it gets later and later, right? But according to what I understand, the way the world's going, history seems to be following that path as well. We're at the end. I don't know how much time is left, but certainly not 1,000 years, certainly not hundreds of years. Very little time. Once HaKadosh Baruch Hu finally comes out, and just if this actually does result in the war of Gog and Magog, and Mashiach actually does come in our time, and the evil is taken away from the world, so does Bechira go. All of a sudden, we'll be standing looking, what did I do? All that time, all that opportunity to build my dust through my own free will choices, to get the Nun Shari Bina to rise to that level. And now it's gone forever. There's not a lot of time left. Purim this year represents a tremendous opportunity, more than any other in our entire lifetime. And who knows how many times since, before that as well. Take it to heart. Study the Mishkan. Understand what we've spoken about and apply it to life. It will not only change your Purim, it'll change your whole mabat, your whole perspective on life. and give you the capability to rise above everyday mundane events that plague everybody else and drag them down and become like weights around their ankles. We're not meant to live on that level. Klal Yisrael is different. Purim says that and gives us the wherewithal to rise above that world that keeps pulling us back, the world of Amalek, to go back into the clouds of glory. We remain protected from him and all the doubt that he causes to fester and to grow within us, to distract us away from our ultimate completion and closest to God.